demonstrating for personal freedom but putting public health at risk. Governments are facing a backlash as public safety measures clash with civil liberties. Are these legitimate expressions of frustration, or are other factors fueling the violence? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today on The Newsmakers, we look at anti-lockdown protests around the globe. Well, could the Netherlands be heading for civil war? It sounds melodramatic, but that's what the mayor of Eindhoven says he fears if violence in his city continues. Dutch police say rioters protesting coronavirus restrictions are a mix of anti-government fringe groups and bored hooligans. And the Prime Minister scoffed at the idea that any of the protests are really about a loss of personal freedom. The Netherlands isn't the only country to see angry citizens on its streets. Over the last month, cities in Germany and Austria, as well as the UK and Israel, have seen unmasked masses rally against the government. From relatively peaceful protests in Toronto to deadly demonstrations in Lebanon, is this defiance a reaction to increasingly tougher COVID-19 restrictions or a response to greater social unrest and uncertainty amid a global health crisis? Haider Abbasi has more.
Dutch streets set alight. Protest against coronavirus restrictions here turned into riots. In cities and towns across the Netherlands, shops have been vandalized and looted, and hundreds detained by police. People marched on the streets after the government introduced a nighttime curfew on January 23rd. Anyone caught violating it could be fined.
I do not agree with the actual politics in the Netherlands and the restrictions of freedom. The elderly are vulnerable, but there are also many young people who are vulnerable. And young people are the future of this country.
Restaurants and pubs in the Netherlands have been closed since October. 2 months later, schools and non-essential shops were also shut. More than 14,000 Dutch have died from the coronavirus, and nearly 1 million are infected. Mayors across the country say they'll introduce emergency laws to prevent further rioting.
What we saw has nothing to do with fighting for freedom. We didn't take all these measures for fun. We did so because we are fighting against the virus. And it's the virus which is actually robbing our freedom.
The Netherlands isn't alone. There have been anti-lockdown protests around the world since restrictions were first introduced by governments to contain the spread of COVID-19. Experts in public health say the measures are necessary to save lives. But the cost has been unprecedented. Businesses have gone bust and tens of millions are out of work. And the pandemic has pushed several nations into recession. But not everyone is suffering. According to the charity Oxfam, the mega-rich grew richer during the pandemic. In a report released last month, Oxfam says the combined wealth of the world's billionaires rose by nearly $4 trillion last year. In the same period, the number of people forced into poverty increased by up to 500 million. Oxfam says it will take a decade for most to recover from the economic fallout. Critics also warn that some nations have exploited the restrictions to crush dissent. One civil liberty group says democracy itself is under lockdown. So is more civil unrest expected as public restrictions are extended? And is the pandemic making the world a more unequal place? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
We'll talk more about what's behind the protests, particularly in the Netherlands. I'm joined from Amsterdam by Jeroen van Wijngaarden. He is a Dutch MP with the governing People's Party for Freedom and Democracy. In Utrecht is Israel Butler, the head of advocacy for the Civil Liberties Union in Europe. And from London, political commentator Andre Walker. Thanks all so much for being with us. Let me begin in Amsterdam. Jeroen, given what your Prime Minister actually said, do you believe these protesters have any legitimate cause to take to the streets like this?
I think these protests were not protests, essentially. What we've been looking at here were riots, looting of shops, and this goes way beyond what we know as legitimate protest. I think it's very important to distinguish these two. The amount of violence we have seen against our police forces, the shops that have been looted and demolished is totally unacceptable. And that's also why there has been a very tough reaction and many rioters and looters are being prosecuted as we speak. Bank accounts have been confiscated, and so have cars have been confiscated. So we will make them pay and go for jail for rioting and looting here.
Okay. Andre, let me ask you, because I know you said before you sympathize with these protesters. Why?
Well, first of all, I mean, I don't know how worried they'd be about going to prison because they're already under house arrest. Look, I don't know about the situation in the Netherlands, but let me tell you the situation in Britain. If the number of coronavirus cases increases, the government demands a lockdown. And if the number of coronavirus cases decreases, the government says the lockdown's working and we should do more of it. There is no plan whatsoever to end the lockdown. It becomes increasingly draconian. And the problem is this. We saw Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, on the television there saying it's the coronavirus's problem. The problem here is that our leaders have lost all sense of perspective. What they're very interested in is controlling the virus. They have lost all interest in defending the economy. They've lost all interest in defending civil liberties. In Britain, it's National Child's Mental Health Day. The mental health problems we are inflicting on our children by banning them from going to school effectively, permanently, is hugely damaging. A report out says that every single child in Britain, on average, will lose £40,000 during their lifetime,
right, but Andre,
as a result of this lockdown.
Just quickly, I mean, it's also hugely damaging for them to prematurely lose their grandparents, you know, or their parents or vulnerable people in their families.
Well, hey, look, I'm not in favour of the coronavirus.
Nobody
I don't want
is.
it. I don't want it to run riot. The issue here is this. Look, we know that in the United Kingdom, the total number of people under the age of 65 who had no pre-existing medical complaints, who have died of the coronavirus, is around 380. We have spent £380 billion on this. That is £1,000 million per healthy person who has died from the disease. I think that that is grossly irresponsible. Now, the fact that older people are vulnerable, you know, my mother had lung cancer and we got her to self-isolate for months before the government told us to. The problem here is this. You know, whilst older people should self-isolate, vulnerable people should self-isolate, it is the ban on healthy people who are not in danger from leaving their houses, which is irresponsible, and governments need to stop.
All right. I need to get Israel's sentiments on this. You feel people do have a right to protest, but it does need to be done responsibly. How so? How can you have this kind of public gathering and have it be responsible when there is a public health crisis?
I mean, the point of the right to protest is for citizens to be able to convey their concerns to their political representatives. And I think there have actually been quite a few very good examples of how that can be done responsibly in the Netherlands. So there were a number of protests in different cities where local governments worked with the organizers in order to have socially distanced protests so that people were able to convey their views without posing any kind of health risk. So that if the object there is to get your views across, it's possible to do it in a safe manner. And frankly, governments should be facilitating this democratic exchange.
Okay, Israel, I just want to ask you quickly. I mean, some of this, when I saw these kind of riots and looting, it invoked memories of, you know, the protests against the World Trade Organization back in Seattle in the 90s. It seemed counterproductive at that time. Of course, there were legitimate reasons for rallying, but it came down to that violence when there were stores broken into, cars turned over. Why? Why do ralliers, demonstrators cross that line? And is it productive in any way?
I don't think protesters do cross that line. Rioters cross that line. And I think it's a mistake to confuse the legitimate right to protest with desires that other people may have to riot and bring about destruction. I also think it's important to put this in context. I mean, the vast majority of Dutch population is in favor of these measures, and relatively speaking, the number of riots is extremely small.
Right, that's true, Jeroen. I mean, we're talking only about hundreds versus, even thousands of demonstrators. There's just a few hundred people. Do you think potentially the government or the press really in the Netherlands is validating their actions by covering this and presenting it as perhaps having a more legitimate cause than you believe it does?
No, I don't think as a politician I'm in the position to blame the press for anything here, because these are unprecedented riots that we've seen here. So it's a news event that needs coverage, but I do think it's important to point out that the challenge here is to fight the virus and not each other. And the most people in our country I believe this, and they resent these riots. So I agree with what Israel said on that.
Okay, Andre, I want to get back to you because you had said at one point, it is up to us, to be responsible. It is not for the government to say, everyone must lock down like this. But in reality, it just doesn't work that way. If all people acted responsibly, we really wouldn't have to have rules and laws, and I mean government for that matter. So how are you really, go ahead.
I think that's absolute nonsense. The suggestion that the problem here is that people are ignoring the rules, I don't think is fair. Let me talk to you about what's happened in Britain. The first national lockdown, its purpose was to give the NHS time to build what they called the Nightingale hospitals, these super anti-coronavirus hospitals, which we did. Then the government came along and said it needed a second national lockdown. The purpose of that was what they called to flatten the curve, which of course we did. And then we came on to the third national lockdown. The purpose of the third national lockdown was to give the NHS time to vaccinate all of the elderly and vulnerable people. Well, we've now done that. And now we've seen a study from the University of Warwick, which is saying there should be a fourth national lockdown. This time, what we need to do is ensure that every member of the population is vaccinated and that each and every vaccine is 85% effective. Now, when we complete that fourth national lockdown, there will be a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, an eighth, a ninth, a 10th national lockdown. In fact, our chief scientific advisor, Chris Whitty, is saying that there should be an annual national lockdown every year to prevent the flu. I think those people that you're seeing out in the street protesting are the responsible ones. They're the ones that are saying it's vital to keep our economy going, that every single society to be successful needs a balance between people who are willing to take risks and those people who are risk averse. At the moment, all of our public policy is based on a dangerous risk aversion, which is killing our economy and damaging the future of our children.
Okay, Jeroen, the complaints of the protesters in the Netherlands, many of them are very similar to what Andre is saying. So what is your response as a leader in your country?
I do think it's important to keep listening to each other and to the concerns of, for instance, parents with young children who are also struggling at home. And this is why one of the first measures we want to take in the Netherlands is, once it's possible, and I've learned that this will be next week, we will start reopening schools again. So I agree with Mr. Walker that as soon as you can, you have to get rid of these ghastly measures that nobody wants. There is no politician in this country that likes these measures. So we agree on that. And as soon as we can, we have to relieve the measures, but we have to do that in a responsible way. Otherwise, we will see the same as we have seen in London before, with queues of ambulances.
Right.
I don't think. Hang on. I don't think that that's a fair comment, and I don't want to be disrespectful. But it is not true to say that no politicians like these measures. There are some people who truly revel in it. We for every single person you see out on the streets. Well, maybe not in the Netherlands. You guys are often more responsible than we are. But look, every single time we have a national lockdown, it achieves the aim that the politicians wanted it to achieve. And then there is a more draconian reason found to have another lockdown. I believe that some people are ideologically committed here.
Israel, do you believe politicians, some of them, as Andre is alleging, want to do this?
I mean, I can't see that anyone feels it would be popular with an electorate as a way of winning votes to deprive people of their social lives, unless there is a real risk. I mean, civil liberties is all about balancing between each other's freedoms, and I think that for the most part, politicians seeking votes try to strike the best balance between giving as many people as possible as many freedoms at any one time. I can't really speak to sort of conspiracy theories about this.
Okay, then Andre.
But actually, but hang on a second. Let's just unpack what we heard there. Right, you've got somebody on who says he's a civil liberties campaigner, and he says that the job of a politician is to balance what rights they want to give to the public. No. You are born with rights. Politicians need to justify taking them away from you. It is not for somebody to sit at the top of a country saying, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at all the evidence and then decide what civil liberties to give you. That's not the way it works. That's possibly the way it works in the European Union, but it's not the way it's supposed to work. We've got to get out of this mindset, because effectively what is happening across the world now is a scientific experiment. Is it possible to prevent the spread of a virus by depriving people of their civil liberties? And the answer to that, I fear, is no. But more importantly, it's the way that all of our freedoms have been melted overnight. We need to get back to work. We need to get back to school. And unfortunately, that will involve some people dying. That's not my fault. That is the fault of this terrible virus.
You know, Andrea, how do you reconcile, though? I mean, you say these are civil liberties, while the government will argue these are basic public health measures, safety measures to protect citizens in the middle of an unprecedented pandemic, or at least unprecedented for the last 100 years.
Well, I'll tell you what, why don't you publicly state what I've just publicly stated? Why don't you say to every school child in Britain that because 380 people who were healthy and under the age of 65 died of coronavirus, they should lose £40,000 throughout their lifetime? We should unleash an unprecedented public mental health crisis, and we should damage their education.
Again, I'm sorry, if I put it to them, I would also mention that the price could be their own grandparents. I think they might sacrifice the £40,000 you're talking about over the course of a lifetime.
Well, okay. In that case, let them make that decision. But that decision isn't being made for them. There is no level of balance here. I think anybody who's responsible would say that older and vulnerable people should be locked down, and anybody who's responsible would equally say that schools should be reopened. In fact, they probably shouldn't have closed. Government is who is being irresponsible.
Israel, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I mean, this conception of freedom. Look, freedom is about giving people choice. It's not about the absence of restrictions. I have a car. I have the freedom to drive a car within limits. So I'm not allowed to speed down the motorway because that puts other people's lives in danger. I'm not allowed to park in your back garden because that deprives you of your right to property. And similarly, we have to accept that we need to be able to balance our freedom of movement against preserving the lives of other people. I also would strongly question the accuracy of some of the statistics that you're putting out there to justify your argument. But yeah,
I'm happy to tweet them.
The choice
I'm happy
possible.
to tweet them to you after the
giving
meeting.
People the most choice possible. It's not about the absence of restrictions. That is anarchy.
Okay. Israel, I'm going to have to give you the last word. I apologize, we're completely out of time, but I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for joining us on The Newsmakers. Now, the pandemic has changed our lives in countless ways. One of the more noticeable is the change to our financial situation. Now, while many have struggled, an elite few have made a huge profits. As you heard earlier in Haider Abbasi's report, the charity group Oxfam calls it the inequality virus, exposing and exacerbating inequalities in wealth, gender, and race for billions of people. They say that for the first time in recorded history, the COVID-19 crisis may lead to an increase in economic inequality in almost every country at once. Now, the combined wealth of the world's 10 richest men has increased by $500 billion since the pandemic began. That's more than enough to pay for a COVID-19 vaccine for every person on Earth. Elon Musk alone has emerged $120 billion richer and increased his personal fortune sixfold. Now, for the billionaires who were financially hit, it took just 9 months for the fortunes of the top 1,000 richest people to return to their pre-pandemic highs. But for the world's poorest, the recovery could take more than a decade. Here now to talk more about that, Max Lawson, the head of advocacy and public policy at Oxfam International. Max, thanks so much for being with us. So inequality has been exacerbated by the pandemic, but I want to go forward with that with you, because for governments to address that, to address those inequalities, they're going to need to explore mostly, socialist-style policies. And as you know, in the United States, where the richest of the rich actually live, taxes and redistribution of wealth are a very hard sell. Socialism is considered a bad word for tens of millions of Americans. How is it possible to address this and change this inequality trend?
I don't think we're talking about socialism. I think we're talking about common sense. And if you look at opinion polling for greater taxation of the rich or greater taxation of billionaires in the US, it's wildly popular and extremely popular with Democratic voters. You saw greater taxation of wealth, a main plank of many of the contenders for the Democratic primaries. And I think Joe Biden himself has said that he wants to reverse the Trump tax cuts on the richest. So even in the United States, which is the home of capitalism, the idea of fairer taxation of billionaires. Remember, we're in a situation where, because of tax evasion and tax avoidance, billionaires are paying a lower rate of tax than nurses or cleaners. So I don't think it's socialism anymore to ask these billionaires to pay their fair share. And in fact, many of them agree. You can ask Bill Gates, you can ask Warren Buffett. All of them have said we must pay more tax. So I think that's what is one of the key solutions if we're going to solve this inequality crisis.
They've said that for decades. I mean, Warren Buffett has been so outspoken on that for decades now. And it really hasn't mattered. You still see, tens of millions of Americans, even if you feel it's against their own interest, saying, I would rather, aspire to be rich, even if I don't get the benefits of, kind of socialist economic policy in any way. I would rather have that aspiration to be rich and know that no one's going to take it for me through taxes than to have to watch very wealthy people pay higher taxes for my benefit.
I would disagree. I think it's simply not true that the majority of Americans are against taxation of the super rich. They're in favor of it. Poll after poll has shown that to be the case. And that was before the coronavirus crisis, which has supercharged inequality and has shown ordinary people that they're only a paycheck away from destitution. I think that the last year has transformed the way we look at the world, and it's made us understand the value of supermarket shelf stackers, of nurses, of the people who really keep our economy going, and maybe they're slightly more valuable than hedge fund managers. So I would really disagree with you on that one. I think the world is changing. I think people's views have changed. And I think when it comes to paying the bill for this crisis, the chances are that we will be looking to increase taxation of the richest, which is what we must do urgently.
We must. In the meantime, though, before those changes come, I mean, there is an option of the ultra-wealthy to engage in more philanthropy. Is there a way, I don't know if I can say, to obligate the world's wealthiest, to give back or become better philanthropists? Because in the meantime, that might provide some sort of solution. Would you encourage that?
Well, I'm not sure the difference between obligatory philanthropy and tax is a very thin line. But I think philanthropy is a good thing. I think the impact that someone like Bill Gates has had on the vaccines is very positive. But it's absolutely no substitute for progressive taxation. And the vast majority of billionaires do not give much money away. And if they do, it's as a form of tax break, and it's their pet project, or they're spending it like Jeff Bezos on going to space, and same with Elon Musk. Jeff Bezos has told the world that he cannot think of anything on Earth to spend his money on, so he wants to spend it on going to space.
Right.
We can't have a situation where we continue to shovel money into the bank accounts of these super rich men when ordinary people are struggling day in, day out.
It's fascinating, though, because I have spoken to very wealthy Americans that even though they could never spend the money they have said they don't want to pay higher taxes because they want to decide what good causes they're going to put their wealth into via philanthropy. Often you see they don't actually engage that heavily in it. But yeah, again, the same argument is there. Max,
I would ask.
go ahead.
A nurse doesn't get to choose where her taxes are spent. I don't see why, just because you're super rich, you get to choose. It's our obligation and our duty to pay our taxes, and then it's the role of democratically elected governments to decide how those taxes are spent. And we would hope they're spent on supporting the vulnerable, buying more medical supplies, paying for nurses. That's what we need to see happen.
Max Lawson, Head of Advocacy and Public Policy from Oxfam, thank you so much for being with us. That is all for this edition of The Newsmakers. Thanks so much for joining us.